This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So, on the 27th of September 1749, Philip Stanhope, the 4th Earl of Chesterfield, wrote a letter to his son, who was travelling the Italian peninsula at the time, bestowing the following advice. You are travelling now in a country once so famous for both arts and arms. View it, therefore, with care. Consider it classically and politically, and do not run through it, as too many of your young countrymen do, musically, and, to use a ridiculous word, knick-knackily. No piping nor fiddling, I beseech you, no days lost in poring upon almost imperceptible intaglios and cameos, and do not become a virtuoso of small wares. Form a taste of painting, sculpture, and architecture, if you please. Those are liberal arts, and a real taste and knowledge of them become a man of fashion very well. But beyond certain bounds, the man of taste ends, and the frivolous virtuoso begins. As Chesterfield's letter confirms, smaller objects such as engraved gemstones were not deemed worthy of the erudite tourist's attention, but better left to those who travelled knick-knackily. In the previous year, Chesterfield had provided a definition of the knick-knack, a category he designated the preserve of, quote, the trifling and frivolous mind. Chesterfield's bias for the large and the remarkable has been echoed by scholarship examining the artistic legacy of the Grand Tour. The smaller, yet arguably more proliferate souvenir has actually been subject to comparative neglect, and consequently some of the more unusual collections of Grand Tour souvenirs, such as those of Jane and Mary Parmenter of A la Ronde in Devon, have been notably understudied as a result. So the first part of this paper will serve as an introduction to the kinds of souvenirs as amassed by Jane and Mary during their grand tour of circa 1784 to 91, discussing them with regards to the artistic incorporation of their collection into the decorative programme of the house and its furnishings. Thanks to the use of explicitly personal objects in the decorative programme of A la Ronde, the Parmenters' collections themselves may be viewed as a potent way to reconstruct the cousins' lives and relationships, which have been previously obscured by the loss of their archive. Here, the souvenir functions as an eloquent object and is emblematic of the narrative capacity of material culture to articulate the past. In utilising the souvenirs of their tour in conjunction with found objects from their Exmouth surroundings, such as bird feathers and shells, the Parmenters were able to celebrate and objectify the significant portion of their lives spent travelling, turning the house into a living reliquary of their tour. Functioning in this way, the Parmenters' souvenirs evoke experience and therefore memory, imbuing them with great emotive potential. Accordingly, not only were their souvenirs used to recall narratives of travel, but also travelling companions. With this in mind, the final section of the paper will begin to suggest some of the emotional motivations of this programme of collection and subsequent display, tying it to the Parmenters' personal relationships, both familial and based on friendship. As historians and material culturalists, we take for granted that objects reveal histories and preoccupations of their owners or makers, and a study of the decorative objects as created here at A la Ronde demonstrates just how clearly these women themselves were aware of the potential of visual objects to weave historical, personal, and emotional narratives. So Jane Parmenter was the daughter of wealthy merchant John Parmenter and his wife Jane Airborne. In 1769 she was sent to live with her aunt in London, and upon her mother's death in 1773 she assumed responsibility for the care of her younger siblings, as well as her two younger cousins, who included Mary Parmenter. Having inherited a large sum of money upon her father's death, Jane and her sister Elizabeth moved with their remaining siblings to London in 1780. Whilst Mary had received an equally impressive income from several of her own properties following her sister's death in 1783. It was in this financially advantageous position that the cousins embarked on their continental tour, leaving London in 1784 and travelling to France in the company of Jane's younger invalid sister Elizabeth, as well as a further unknown female travelling companion. Deriving its name from its 16-sided form, A la Ronde was designed by the Parmenters upon return from this extensive continental tour, and is remarkable for its shell and featherwork interior and extensive collections of objets d'art, which have been integrated via various craft techniques into the decorative fabric of their home. And here are just a few examples of their craft. You can just see the shell and feather gallery at the top, and that is a picture of the staircase that leads up to it, and some more of the featherwork that's in the drawing room of the house. Mary Parmenter's will lays out instructions for the inheritance of the estate of A la Ronde, wherein only a female descendant could claim ownership of the property. Entrance into marriage would negate the legal ownership of the estate, as could making alterations to the property and the failure to maintain the house and gardens. With such strictures in mind, it seems clear that the construction, decoration, and projected legacy of A la Ronde were essential in the creation of an explicitly gendered space, wherein feminine accomplishment could flourish, sustained and protected throughout following centuries. The decorative programme at A la Ronde may therefore be viewed as a highly significant exemplar of the role of female aesthetic agency in the construction of gendered identity, both in the 18th century and amongst its later owners. Previous attempts to study A la Ronde have been frustrated by this lack of a familial or house archive. With the Parmenters' records moved to Exeter for safekeeping during World War II, much was destroyed by the Luftwaffe bombings that devastated the city. Consequently, there is remarkably little secondary literature examining the house, despite its rich collections and fascinating history. Whilst Jane kept detailed accounts of their travels in the form of journals, only those as far as Dijon survive, and this is a loss of about 7 years' worth of travel accounts, so it's quite upsetting. And the itinerary of the rest of the tour can only be assumed. Given the great length of time spent travelling, as well as the surviving souvenirs within the house itself, it seems not unlikely that the Parmenters toured through France, Italy, Germany, Switzerland, and possibly Spain and Portugal. Whilst touring Italy in 1740, Horace Walpole wrote from London that, quote, "How I like the inanimate part of Rome you will soon perceive upon my arrival in England. I am far gone in medals, lamps, idols, prints, and all the small commodities to the purchase of which I can attain. I would buy the Colosseum if I could." Walpole's identification of the souvenir as an inanimate part of Rome confirms the close material association between the souvenir and the location of its fabrication or purchase by the tourist. In acquiring the souvenir, Walpole feels he has purchased a piece of Rome itself. So with the purchase of a souvenir a defining characteristic of the tourist experience, perhaps this form of consumption can therefore be viewed as an attempt to replicate or emulate the routines of travel that were so much a part of the standard image of the masculinized Grand Tour. The collection and display of the souvenir, then, explicitly recalls the Parmenters' participation in this rite of passage, emphasising their self-identification as traveller. By examining the souvenirs of the female traveller, one is able to counter a homogenous notion of a masculinized and classicizing Grand Tour, instead positing a new, more encompassing engagement with the foreign and the antique that is instead figured as essential to the construction of feminine identity through processes of collection, integration, and display. The use of these objects within forms of delicate artistic practice and homosocial space, then, suggests that the Grand Tour was equally yet distinctively important in the creation of an explicitly personal femininity as that of rational and enlightened masculinity. At A la Ronde, we have numerous examples of souvenirs we might think about as being produced for a specifically female tourist market, so micromosaic jewellery being an example. Nevertheless, it is important not to hold the Parmenters' collection as something wholly removed from more traditional masculine forms of collecting, but to situate their souvenirs in relation to these existing accounts. Testament to the necessity of this reintegration is the Parmenters' display of prints from Piranesi's Le Antichità Romane, which are displayed in an area of the drawing room alongside the featherwork and that kind of thing. Such inclusions within their collection firmly root the Parmenter souvenirs within a more standard trajectory of grand tour collecting, with these objects marrying, both intellectually and through physical proximity, explicitly masculine traditions of collecting with explicitly feminine traditions of making. So a pair of non-matching handcrafted specimen tables exemplify the role of the souvenir in the development of the Parmenter's craft, described inconsequentially by Hugh Mellor in the National Trust catalogue as, quote, a little painted table, the top of which has been inlaid with semi-precious stones, marbled glass and gems. I shall be focusing on the example on the right of the slide, which is octagonal in form and dates from around 1790. Mounted on a rosewood base and augmented with painted floral decoration, the inlay table is a colourful bricolage of visual and textural contrast, comprised of natural materials, prefabricated souvenirs, and apparently ancient antiquities. These specimen tables work on several levels to reflect the complex dynamics between home and abroad, person and object, and finally collector and artist, which render A la Ronde such an evocative space. Primarily, firstly, they encapsulate the physical relocation of the souvenir from its place of purchase to its subsequent home, while simultaneously constituting an emulative reconstruction of the kinds of objects the Parmenters must have seen whilst touring Europe. Specimen tabletops, so named after the specimens of a variety of marbles and semi-precious stones of which they were comprised, were a common tour souvenir, bought by travellers whilst abroad and transported home. The contrasting marbles that constituted these slabs were often sourced from ruins, archaeological excavations, and the destruction of ancient monuments. At least 6 specimen tables were included in the ill-fated cargo of the Westmoreland, one of which is pictured here, and were described in the inventory as a beautiful marble table inlaid with various fine stones. An example of one of these decorative tabletops, as transported on the vessel, is inlaid with stones set out in a rigidly geometric format, with each specimen assigned an individual number. As an object of scholarly inquiry, the numbered specimen table provides a provocative contrast, both in appearance and function, to the examples we find at A la Ronde. Here, the haphazard distribution of stones and minerals seems designed more for the provocation of personal memory than to prompt disinterested and antiquarian contemplation. Situated within the mosaic-like bricolage of the Parmenter specimen table are 2 examples of micro-mosaics, a popular form of tourist souvenir. 2 panels depicting near-identical amphorae and constructed from tiny cube-shaped tesserae are included within the surface of the tabletop. Developed by mosaicists employed by the Vatican Mosaic Workshop, micromosaics became increasingly popular after the reduction of commissions for large-scale mosaics, which occurred from around 1757. Charlotte Eaton, whilst in Rome, noted the proliferation of such wares and their producers in 1817, when she described, quote, hundreds of artists, or rather artisans, who carry on the manufacture of mosaics on a small scale. Snuff boxes, rings, necklaces, brooches, earrings are made in immense quantity, and since the English flocked in such numbers to Rome, all the streets leading to the Piazza di Spagna are lined with the shops of these mosaicisti. Often representing scenes from antiquity or famous monuments encountered whilst on the tour, micromosaics, and specifically micromosaic jewellery, offered a continuum between home and abroad through its close bodily connection with its possessor. That these objects were not exclusive items, but mass-produced tourist wares, and also is highlighted by the quote from Eaton, is confirmed by the fact that a version of these micromosaics was recently sold in London in the form of a pendant brooch. And just for comparison, you can see that these are in fact exactly the same object. And similarly, a gold bezel mounted micromosaic plaque is here presented in the form of a ring and features a strikingly similar urn design as from the V&A. So what is striking about the subsumption within this ring of an object that was also used in the Parmenter's table is the complicity of such tourist wares in the creation of personal meaning. The varying forms that such micromosaics took on reflects not only the malleability of such items, but its easy incorporation into the needs of the consumer, with the same body adorning body and interior alike. This malleable semantic potential, as evoked by the micromosaic, has a certain pathos, given that the representation of such antique vases during this period was often designed to evoke mourning or the memory of a loved one. You can see this in this detail from a mourning bracelet, which is also from the V&A and features a similar kind of form and design. This function of the urn, both historical and symbolic, is solidified in the language of 18th century mourning through the notion of repetition, which Marcia Poynton identifies as essential in creating the connection between, quote, mourning as concept and jewellery as artefact. Such convention in the iconography of mourning can therefore be understood not as fashionable accordance, but more specifically in relation to the need for, quote, a universal vocabulary that may be repeated ritually and ceremonially and which will be universally understood. In other words, by translating mourning into a language and therefore an object that can be read both by its wearer and owner, but also by those external to the relationship, to the lost relationship. Not only does this repetitive form of visual language allow for an object to be read at its time of its creation, but also enables the historian to read the object, and as such, the table is emblematic of the kind of eloquent object embodied by the souvenir. Beyond its collection and translation within a series of other purchased objects in order to create an intimate history or of travel or the journey then, such items could also be used to create the most loaded personal narrative of all, the commemoration of a loved one. In utilising a distinctive language of memorialisation, the table therefore compels the viewer to recognise an undeniable absence from this tightly bound homosocial culture as present at A la Ronde. Within the central reservoir of the table, and bordered by the two micromosaic urns, is a painted enamel plaque. Forming the central point of the tabletop, the plaque depicts a Vestal Virgin who pours libations onto a burning pyre in a pseudo-sacrificial gesture. In both its subject matter and form, the plaque accords with contemporary visual and material culture of mourning and reads, "Life shall triumph over death." And I've included another object just for comparison, this time a brooch, and there's similar sort of sepia-toned watercolour detail and memorialising inscription. So far from a random bricolage of purchased and found objects, I would like to suggest that this specimen table in fact acts as a mourning device, performing a specifically dedicatory function. It commemorates the loss of Jane's sister and Mary's cousin, Elizabeth Parmenter, who died shortly after their return from Europe in 1791. Here then, the souvenir extends its traditional memorial function to enact a commemorative gesture. Beyond its objectification of the Parmenters' tour, the table is an associative artefact which refers to the loss of their beloved travelling companion. The suggested function of the specimen table is supported not only by the homosocial space of A la Ronde, but also by the existence of another specimen table, which contains within its central lockable reservoir letters and ephemera that had once belonged to another of the Parmenters' deceased friends. Here then, the careful juxtaposition of prefabricated items allows the Parmenters to create a profoundly personal object, which through the processes of physical and emotional translation can be viewed as emblematic of the relationships experienced by the Parmenters throughout their lives, those lost, that with Elizabeth Parmenter, and those continued through Jane's and Mary's cohabitation. Rather than simply recalling the location visited, or even impressing upon visitors this act of travel, the souvenir is transported home and actively utilised by the Parmenters, whose craft practices give these objects a deeper range of meaning and association. In Collecting Reconsidered, Susan Pearce argues that souvenirs are, quote, intrinsic parts of our past experience because they possess the survival power of materiality not shared by words, actions, sights, and other elements of experience. They alone have the power to carry the past into the present. In this sense, all material artefacts may be discussed as functioning as some sort of souvenir, that through the process of translation into a particular context may continue to speak, even when the textual source has long been destroyed. At A la Ronde, then, it is the convergence of the figure of collector and artist that gives these objects meaning, and their translation into the decorated space of the home that allows them to function not only eloquently, but emotionally.